Hey everybody, how's it going out there? I figured I would do a deep dive into the history of the Democrat Party because I think a lot of people don't know about their history. A lot of things happened where the media decided to be pro-Democrat and anti-Republican. That's happened around in the 1960s. And so in my full lifetime, all I've remembered is how the Democrat media has been against Republicans, and everything it publishes is biased against Republicans. Even though Republicans have the best intentions for everybody, and Republicans have done the most to increase freedom for everybody on the planet, of every political group, of every type of political structure on the planet. And America has done more to lift people out of poverty and into freedom than any country ever in the history of the planet. It took a look at history, tried to get away from the mistakes everybody made. It looked at what worked, and it pieced all that together in a fabric that all the states had to vote on to come up with the federal government. And they came up with a document that, after great debate, all the states signed, instituting the federal government. And here we are. We have an error correction system built into that. And then we look at our history as to what happened in American history and where we are today. And specifically, I was always curious about the Democrat Party. So I've studied it all my life, and I'm going to give that information to you so that you can be made aware of what the Democrat Party has been like in its total existence. Now, in 1829, the Indian hater Andrew Jackson became the first Democrat president of the United States. In 1830, Andrew Jackson came up with the Indian Removal Act, and this was opposed by Jeremy Everts, Theodore Frelinghuysen, and Davy Crockett. In 1831, Democrat Andrew Jackson started removal of the Choctaw Indians. And in opposition to him, William Lloyd Garrison, an abolitionist, started a newspaper called The Liberator. It was for freeing the slaves. In 1832, Andrew Jackson ordered the removal of the Seminole Indians. In 1832, William Garrison started the Anti-Slavery Society in New England. This was in opposition to Democrat Andrew Jackson. 1832 was also the year that Jim Crow character was introduced on the stage by Thomas Rice. In 1834, Democrat Andrew Jackson removed the Creek Indians, a continuation of the Trail of Tears by the Democrats. In 1835, the abolitionist movement was gaining momentum. It had risen to 300 groups. Democrats retaliated by burning down people's houses in Boston. In 1835, the Democrats started a mob so they could kill William Garrison. In 1837, President Andrew Jackson removed the Chickasaw Indians. In 1838, Democrat President Martin Van Buren removed the Cherokee Indians. In 1843, in opposition to the Democrats, Massachusetts passed the Personal Liberty Act. This made it so Massachusetts would not have to return fugitive slaves to other states. It infuriated the Democrats. In 1850, there was a great compromise between the Whig Party and the Democrat Party. The Whig Party would have California come in as a free state and would ban the trade of slaves in Washington, D.C. The Democrat Party would get the Fugitive Slave Act, where Massachusetts would be forced by the federal government to use federal power to increase slavery in the South. And they also were breaking up the territories in a way so the territories would be able to decide slavery. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe publishes Uncle Tom's Cabin. In 1854, Anthony Burns was an escaped slave. He made it from Democrat Virginia to free Massachusetts in Boston. This infuriated the Democrats in Virginia. So they forced the government's hand to invoke the Fugitive Slave Law, which overrode states' rights in favor of Democrat slavery. In 1854, the Democrats invoked the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which voided the Missouri Compromise, which kept slavery in the South and free states in the North. This infuriated abolitionists and started the Republican Party. In 1854, the Republican Party was established to stop the expansion of slavery. In 1854, the Democrats illegally rode voters from Missouri into Kansas so they could illegally and by voter fraud make Kansas a slave state. There were 1,114 legal voters, but 1,729 votes were cast. In 1856, Democrat Sheriff Samuel J. Jones attacked and ransacked Republican Lawrence, triggering Bleeding Kansas. In 1856, Charles Sumner excoriated the institution of slavery and slaveholders. This made Preston Brooks, a Democrat slaveholder from South Carolina, very angry. So while Charles Sumner was trapped in his desk, Preston Brooks came over with his cane with a gold top on it, beat him over the head multiple times until Charles Sumner passed out. After the event, Preston Brooks was not charged with any misdemeanor. Rather, the Democrat newspapers of South Carolina heralded him as a hero and told him he should have beat Charles Sumner to death. In 1857, Democrat President James Buchanan was elected. Now, James Buchanan was a Democrat who loved slavery. He wanted to defend the territories to give them rights to approve slavery, and he approved of the murders and terrorist acts that were going on in Kansas at the time. In 1859, the Fugitive Slave Law was declared unconstitutional, a huge victory for Republicans in the North. For Democrats in the South, they were infuriated. They saw this as a blow against slavery, so they pleaded that the northern states did not have states' rights to interfere with slavery. In 1860, Republican President Abraham Lincoln was elected. Abraham Lincoln was the first Republican president elected in the history of the United States of America. In 1860, Democrat South Carolina seceded from the Union of the United States of America on the basis of slavery. In 1861, Democrat James Buchanan did his best to sow the seeds of discord in the United States, giving misinformation to newspapers all over the country to divide the country in hatred against Abraham Lincoln. In 1861, the Democrats were infuriated that there was a federal building near them. The federal building was called Fort Sumter. It was near Fort Moultrie. So the Democrats fired on this federal building and thus started the Civil War. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln declared every person free. All slaves in the South were free. This infuriated Democrats everywhere. Lincoln started the draft in the North, and the Democrats in New York City ran through the streets, burning down black buildings, black orphanages, and rounding up black people to hang them in the city streets. In 1865, the 13th Amendment was created and slavery was abolished. In 1865, Democrat John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln by shooting him in the head with a bullet. In 1865, the unthinkable happened. Andrew Johnson, a Democrat, assumed the presidency. He did everything in his power to undo the work of the Civil War and the freeing of the black people. He gave all the land that would have gone to the black people, gave it back to the slave owners, and did everything in his power to work against the black community. In 1865, the Democrat KKK was started by Democrat James R. Crow. In 1866, Democrat Andrew Johnson vetoed the Civil Rights Act that would have helped the black community. In 1867, the Republicans passed two Reconstruction bills to help black people, But Democrat Andrew Johnson vetoed both of them. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railway was completed. This allowed the wealthy Democrats to pick up shop from the South, get on that Transcontinental Railway right across the country to California, and create a new slave state where instead of using black slaves, they would use Mexican illegals. In 1873, at the Colfax Massacres, the Democrats used terrorism to indiscriminately fire at everyone at Republican events. This striking of terror thwarted the Reconstruction attempts. In 1873, women like Eliza Jane Thompson prayed at bars and clubs to denounce alcoholism. The Democrats were infuriated, so they used fire hoses to spray the women down. They also used chilled ice, chilled water, and chilled beer to dump on the women to infuriate their advance against alcoholism and drug addiction. In 1874, the Democrats formed the White League. This was to terrorize black freedmen from voting. In 1874, William Pitt Kellogg was elected governor. He was a Republican and the Democrats were furious. So the Democrats fought against him and laid siege to the government buildings. After 100 casualties and 3 days of fighting, federal troops finally arrived, and William Pitt Kellogg was restored. In 1875, the Republicans were finally able to pass the Civil Rights Act. This bill was headed up by Charles Sumner and Benjamin Butler. The Democrats were infuriated, so they started the Red League, a league whose sole purpose was to kill and terrorize black voters. By 1877, the Democrats had successfully frustrated the work of Reconstruction by the Republicans. This allowed Democrats to freely oppress the black community by state mandate. In 1883, the Civil Rights Act was declared unconstitutional. This was a huge blow to the Republicans, but a huge victory for the Democrats who hated black people. In 1887, the Georgia Railroad Company decided to make it illegal for blacks and whites to ride in the same train car. In 1890, Louisiana passed a mandate that all train companies in their state had to have separate train cars for blacks and whites. In 1905, Democrats were furious because Republican Theodore Roosevelt invited Booker T. Washington to the White House. Democrats James Vardaman and James Tillman were furious at Theodore Roosevelt. In 1913, Woodrow Wilson instituted segregation in federal workplaces. In 1936, Jesse Owens made it to the Olympics in Berlin. Now, the Democrat socialist evolutionist named Hitler was infuriated that his Germans were racing against Jesse Owens, a black man. Joseph Goebbels said, "You might as well have gazelle or deer on your team." In 1942, American Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt ordered Japanese citizens to be relocated to Japanese internment camps within the United States. In 1947, Jackie Robinson became the first black professional baseball player. Democrats called him an Uncle Tom. In 1948, we see a turn for the better. Using Executive Order 9981, Harry Truman abolishes segregation for blacks in federal work buildings. In 1955, Dr. King started the bus ban. In 1960, Dr. King, who was working with the Republican Party and leading protests against segregation, he was arrested and put in jail. Now, JFK made a phone call which led to his release. Now, many black voters started voting Democrat at this time in favor of Dr. King being released from jail. In 1963, Democrat George Wallace tried to block integration of James Hood and Vivian Malone into the white school system. In 1964, Lyndon B. Johnson and the Republican legislation passed the Civil Rights Bill. In 1964, Democrat Senator Richard Russell opposed passing the Civil Rights Bill. In 1965, Jim Clark and Bull Connor break up riots at Selma, Alabama, using attack dogs, fire hoses, and cattle prods to injure black people. In 1965, Viola Liuzzo was gunned down by the Democrat KKK. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed. In 1965, Malcolm X was gunned down by Islamic terrorists. In 1966, Bobby Seale and Huey Newton started the Black Panther movement. In 1967, Democrats started riots in Harlem. In 1968, Democrat James Earl Ray shot down Dr. King in Memphis, Tennessee. Riots ensued. In 1970, Bill Ayers with Weather Underground bombs the New York City Police Department. In 1971, Bill Ayers with Weather Underground bombs the United States Capitol building. In 1972, Bill Ayers with Weather Underground bombs the Pentagon, goes on to become a professor at the University of Illinois. In 1981, John Hinckley Jr., to impress Democrat Jodie Foster, attempted the assassination of Republican President Ronald Reagan. 2013 into 2014, the Democrats create the terrorist group called Black Lives Matter. In 2016, Democrats opposed Trump's wall in order so they can keep their form of plantation slavery using Mexican illegals. In 2020, we watch and discussed as BLM and Antifa run ransacking through the Democrat cities unopposed. Cities such as Minneapolis, New York City, Los Angeles, Portland, Seattle. We watch and discussed as $2 billion worth of damage is inflicted upon these cities. We see police cars flipped over, windshields jumped on and smashed. We see people running through the streets with knives and guns and bear spray. We see meth needles everywhere, spray paint sprayed on everything. We see the destruction of private and public property. Buildings set on fire with people in them, government buildings plus even apartment buildings filled with people, Antifa members setting fire in the lower levels of them, seeing what kind of destruction they can wreak upon society. We see assassinations, we see fires, explosions, streets with smoke filled all throughout them. And we wonder what in the world is going on. In the meantime, we see Democrat governors and mayors encouraging the violence and even taking part in it. And we wonder to ourselves, why aren't these people in jail? Isn't there anything that says that since we're a republic, everybody is under the same law, the law of the republic? Isn't there any accountability for these people? So we watch and discuss in this way. To make things even worse, we see the censorship of the education system, including individual teachers and the unions, plus Hollywood and the stars and the NBA and the football leagues. We see the destruction, even a concerted effort with the media outlets, the news people. All three of these groups all combined, powerful groups that influence people, all working in unison for the destruction of the Republican Party, the party that did so much good for society all throughout society. And at the same time, they hate the Republican Party, claiming that the Republican Party will bring hatred and destruction on society. They're in the midst of destroying society, burning society to the ground, killing people. They're the ones doing this and inflicting it on everybody else. They're accusing the Republicans of what they do. This is a common theme that I've seen all throughout my life and all throughout my study of history. It is so unfortunate that the media is the Democrat Party, as we can never cut through and see truth as it should be seen. It's always filtered through the Democrat filter. It's always filtered and framed in such a way that makes them pretend like they're good and everybody else like they're evil. I don't accept this premise at all, and the Americans are watching in horror, waiting for justice to be dealt out to the people that are spreading hatred and destruction. The Democrats encouraging this all throughout time. When we look at the Democrat Party, it looks like the future is very grim. But what I want to do is encourage everybody to search our own selves. Democrats are just seeking their own gain. There's two groups of people, the productive group and the thief group. Well, I think the Democrats are closer to the thief group with their welfare systems, with their New York Stock Exchange systems, their slavery systems, their exploitations of Mexicans, their exploitations of blacks, their exploitations even now of using blacks to destroy society by stoking up hatred to the black community. They do this before every single election, and they do it on purpose so they can keep the black vote. And what's interesting to me is Dr. King was shot by a Democrat. I mean, that should send waves of horror throughout the black community. When you see those pictures of attack dogs launching on black people and fire hoses being used to spray black people down to stop their advance of their protest in Selma, Alabama, you should think, wow, these guys are Democrats. And when you realize that there are mostly white people at the riots, mostly communist Marxist educated by the university communists in our country, when you realize the white people are the ones that are taking part in most of these protests, and the black people are just being used as a prop to stir up white communist Marxist hatred, then this situation becomes even worse. But you see all this destruction, all these conflicts of interest, other international systems like communist China, communist Russia, trying to take over our democracy by using the Democrat Party to internally destroy us. We don't have to do all those things. We don't have to kill each other. Democrats themselves are not the enemy. It's evil within us that's the enemy. See, what we need to do is take part in looking at our own lives, and instead of being the thief society, we need to be the production society. It's here where all of our wealth comes from. When we choose to be productive instead of hating and unforgiving and hurting and killing and destroying, then we change the fabric of our society. Since the Democrats are encouraging this, the Democrat philosophy is rejected by me. But remember, the Democrats are only 80% bad, 20% good. I'll take the 20% good, as well as I'll take the 80% good on the Republican side. And every day I search my own heart, and I hope you search your heart, that we seek truth, that we speak truth, that we live truth. This is the way it has to be to create an awesome society. And of course, I will absolutely not be voting for any Democrat. I hate destruction. I hate killing. I hate theft. I hate that the New York City Democrats sold black people on Wall Street in the past. I hate that Democrats lynched black people. I hate that Democrats did all this destruction all throughout our history. I just can't see why anybody likes that party and likes being a part of that, thinking that they're morally superior to other people. But I know it's that our self-idolatry takes over. We start worshiping ourselves as if we're good, and then we start attacking everybody else as if everybody else is bad. Well, of course, we're all bad. And what we all have to do is check ourselves, examine our own lives, and if there be evil, destructive, wicked ways in ourselves, we have got to rethink those things and eject those things on a continuous daily basis. So I will definitely be voting for Donald Trump, though he's not perfect. When I look at the Democrat Party, they are horrific, and they have been consistently horrific, consistently twisted, consistently race baiting, consistently causing wars and destruction, consistently stealing from people, consistently, even right now, California uses illegals as slaves, all the while they're attacking the rest of society as if the rest of the society are racists. They're the racists using illegals while everybody else is watching them and wondering why in the world they get away with such horrors. So I encourage everybody, look into your own life, change the bad things that are in you, and make the good things in you even better. I hope the best for you. I hope the best for our country. I hope the best for the future, even the world. I think we can be a light to help all societies get the best out of their people so that everyone around the world can be productive citizens instead of thief citizens. So thanks for your time, and I will see you in the next video. Have a great week.